3 days had passed since they buried Shadow. 3 days since Mike Cross had stood in that clearing, watching them lower his partner into the ground. 3 days since he'd felt truly alone for the first time in 12 years. The funeral had been everything Shadow deserved. Full honors, officers from 6 counties, a 21-gun salute that echoed through the mountains. Mike had stood there in his dress uniform, stone-faced, accepting condolences from people who couldn't possibly understand what he'd lost. Shadow wasn't just a dog. He was Mike's partner, his brother, the one constant in a life that had been defined by chaos and loss. Now he was gone, and Mike didn't know how to exist in a world without him. Please support us by subscribing to the channel. The department had given Mike 2 weeks off, but he'd returned after 5 days. Work was the only thing that made sense anymore. Tom Bradley watched him with concern, seeing the hollow look in Mike's eyes, the mechanical way he went through his duties. Ghost, Shadow's grandson, had been transferred to a retired officer's farm upstate. Mike couldn't bear to look at the young dog, couldn't handle the reminder of what he'd lost. The puppy would have a good life there, running free on open land. No pressure to fill impossible shoes. Mike told himself it was the right decision, even as guilt gnawed at him. Tonight, Mike sat alone in his cabin, a half-empty bottle of whiskey on the table beside him. He'd never been much of a drinker, but sleep wouldn't come anymore without chemical assistance. The silence was crushing. No sound of Shadow's breathing, no click of nails on the wooden floor. No warm presence beside his chair. Just emptiness. Mike's phone buzzed. A text from Tom asking if he was okay, if he needed company. Mike ignored it. He didn't want company. He didn't want condolences or understanding or any of the well-meaning gestures people kept offering. He wanted his partner back, and that was the one thing no one could give him. Around midnight, Mike finally stumbled to bed, the whiskey making the world soft and distant. He fell into a restless sleep filled with fragmented dreams of mountain rescues and tactical operations, always searching for Shadow, always hearing his bark just around the corner, but never finding him. Then, at exactly 2:47 a.m., Mike woke to a sound that stopped his heart. Scratching. Not the scratch of a branch against the window or an animal on the roof. The deliberate, persistent scratch of claws on earth. Digging. Mike sat up, his cop instincts overriding the alcohol fog. Someone was on his property. He grabbed his gun from the nightstand and moved silently through the dark cabin. The scratching continued, coming from outside, from the direction of the clearing where Shadow was buried. Mike's rational mind said it was probably a coyote or a bear, something attracted by the disturbed earth. But something deeper, something primal, was screaming that this was different. He stepped onto his porch, weapon ready, eyes adjusting to the moonlight. The scratching had stopped. Everything was silent. Too silent. Then Mike heard it. A sound he'd know anywhere, a sound he'd heard thousands of times over 12 years. The sound he'd thought he'd never hear again. A bark. Shadow's bark. Deep, commanding, unmistakable. Mike's gun hand dropped to his side. His legs moved without conscious thought, carrying him across the yard toward the clearing. His heart was hammering so hard he thought it might burst. This wasn't possible. This couldn't be happening. He was drunk, hallucinating, losing his mind with grief. But the bark came again, stronger this time, and Mike started running. He burst into the clearing and stopped dead. The grave was disturbed. Fresh earth scattered across the ground. And in the center, where the simple stone marker stood, the ground was moving, heaving upward like something beneath was pushing, clawing, fighting its way to the surface. Mike dropped to his knees, his hands digging frantically at the loose soil, throwing handfuls aside. His mind had shut down completely. Logic, reason, everything that made him a good cop, all of it gone. There was only desperate hope and impossible belief. His fingers hit something solid. Warm. Moving. A paw broke through the surface, gray and white fur covered in dirt, claws extended. Then another paw. Mike dug harder, sobbing now, pulling earth away in great chunks. A head emerged. Amber eyes opened, fixing on Mike with perfect recognition and absolute trust. Shadow pulled himself free from the grave, shaking dirt from his coat, looking at Mike like nothing unusual had happened. Like he'd just been napping and it was time to get back to work. Mike couldn't breathe. Couldn't think. Couldn't process what he was seeing. Shadow was standing in front of him, solid and real and undeniably alive. The dog who died in his arms 3 days ago. The dog he'd buried with full honors. The dog who was now pressing his head against Mike's chest, whining softly, asking why his human was so upset. Mike's hands moved over Shadow's body, checking for injuries, for signs of trauma, for anything that would explain this. The dog was warm. His heart was beating strong and steady. His breathing was normal. He seemed completely healthy, better than he'd been in months. The stroke damage was gone. The joint inflammation that had plagued his final months had vanished. Shadow was in his prime again, vital and strong. Mike looked into those amber eyes and saw intelligence, recognition, and something else. Something that whispered of mysteries deeper than Mike's rational mind could accept. Shadow had come back. Somehow, impossibly. Miraculously, Shadow had clawed his way back from death itself. Mike sat in the dirt of the clearing for nearly an hour, holding Shadow, running his hands through the dog's fur over and over, confirming he was real. Shadow bore this with patient tolerance, occasionally licking Mike's face, clearly confused about why his human was so emotional. Eventually, the shock began to fade, replaced by 1,000 questions Mike had no way to answer. He stood on shaky legs and walked back to the cabin, Shadow trotting beside him like nothing had changed. Inside, Mike turned on every light and examined Shadow thoroughly. No wounds. No signs of decomposition. No indication whatsoever that this dog had been dead. His coat was dirty from the grave, but otherwise perfect. His eyes were bright and alert. His movements showed none of the stiffness that had marked his final weeks. Mike checked Shadow's gums, his heartbeat, his breathing. Everything was normal. Better than normal. Shadow seemed younger somehow, more vital. Mike's hands were shaking as he pulled out his phone. Who could he call? Who would believe this? Tom Bradley answered on the first ring, his voice sharp with concern. Mike asking him to come over at 3 a.m. meant something was seriously wrong. Mike's voice was hoarse as he told Tom to get to the cabin immediately, and to tell no one where he was going. 20 minutes later, Tom's truck roared up the driveway. He burst through the door, weapon drawn, expecting to find Mike under attack or injured. Instead, he found Mike sitting calmly at his kitchen table, with Shadow lying at his feet. Tom stopped dead. His face went white. His gun hand dropped slowly to his side. Tom had been at the funeral. Had stood beside Mike at the grave. Had watched them lower Shadow's body into the ground and cover it with earth. And now Shadow was here, alive, looking at Tom with patient expectation, like he was waiting for someone to explain what all the fuss was about. Tom's voice was barely a whisper when he finally managed to speak, asking if he was losing his mind. Mike told him no, they both were. They spent the next 2 hours trying to make sense of the impossible. Tom suggested every rational explanation he could think of. Maybe Shadow hadn't actually been dead, just in some kind of coma. Maybe the veterinarian had made a catastrophic mistake. Maybe they'd buried the wrong dog, and this was all a horrible mix-up. Mike shot down each theory methodically. Sarah Chen was the best veterinarian in 3 counties. She'd pronounced Shadow dead after his organs had shut down. Mike himself had felt Shadow take his last breath. There had been no pulse, no breathing, no brain activity. Shadow had been dead. Mike had sat with the body for hours. There was no mistake. And yet here Shadow was, undeniably alive, and apparently in perfect health. Tom asked the question they were both thinking. What if this wasn't natural? What if something had brought Shadow back? Mike had no answer. He didn't believe in miracles, or magic, or supernatural intervention. He was a cop, trained to deal in evidence and facts. But the evidence was lying on his floor, breathing steadily, occasionally thumping his tail against the hardwood. Tom suggested they call Sarah Chen, get her medical opinion. Mike refused. If word got out about this, Shadow would become a spectacle. Scientists would want to study him. The media would turn it into a circus. Religious groups would claim it was divine intervention. Mike had spent his career protecting Shadow. He wasn't about to stop now. Tom understood, but pointed out they couldn't hide a dog everyone thought was dead. The whole county had attended Shadow's funeral. People would see him. Questions would be asked. Mike said they'd figure something out, but his priority was keeping Shadow safe and out of the spotlight. As dawn broke, they made a plan. Officially. Shadow remained dead and buried. Mike would keep him at the cabin, away from town. They'd say Mike had adopted a new dog, one that happened to look similar to Shadow. It was thin, wouldn't hold up under scrutiny, but it might buy them time to understand what had happened. Tom left just after sunrise, promising to cover for Mike at the office. Alone again, Mike looked at Shadow and asked what the hell had happened to him. Shadow just tilted his head and wagged his tail. Whatever had brought him back, the dog himself seemed unbothered by it. Over the following days, Mike observed Shadow carefully, looking for any sign of what had changed. The dog's behavior was completely normal. He ate with his usual appetite, slept in his favorite spots, responded to commands perfectly. But there were subtle differences. Shadow's senses seemed even sharper than before. He'd react to sounds Mike couldn't hear, would stare at things Mike couldn't see. Once, Mike watched Shadow track something moving through the forest outside, his head turning to follow an invisible path, a low growl rumbling in his chest. When Mike looked, there was nothing there. Most striking was Shadow's energy. The old dog had needed frequent rest, his aging body unable to sustain long activity. Now Shadow could run for hours without tiring. His joints showed no sign of the inflammation that had plagued his final months. He moved like a dog half his age, all grace and power. Mike didn't know whether to be grateful or terrified. A week after Shadow's return, Mike decided to test the dog's capabilities. He set up a training course on his property, the same obstacles Shadow had run countless times in his working years. Jumps, tunnels, scent discrimination, suspect apprehension scenarios. Shadow attacked the course with enthusiasm, clearing every obstacle with ease, his performance flawless. When Mike timed his run, he found Shadow had beaten his best time from 5 years ago. Whatever had happened to Shadow, it had made him stronger. That night, Mike sat on his porch with Shadow beside him and tried to make peace with the impossible. He'd been given his partner back, returned from death for reasons he couldn't understand. He could spend his life questioning it, trying to find rational explanations that didn't exist. Or he could accept the gift and move forward. Shadow's head rested on Mike's knee, those amber eyes looking up with complete trust. Mike made his decision. He didn't need to understand why Shadow had returned. He just needed to be grateful he had. 2 weeks after Shadow's resurrection, Mike received a call that would test his decision to keep his partner's return secret. A child had gone missing in the national forest, a 7-year-old boy named Lucas Brennan who'd wandered away from his family's campsite. Search and rescue teams had been looking for 18 hours with no success. The forest was vast and dense, and time was running out. The incident commander knew Mike's reputation and specifically requested his help. Mike agreed immediately, then faced the dilemma he'd been dreading. Shadow was the best tracking K9 in the state's history. With him, Mike could find that boy. Without him, the search might end in tragedy. But bringing Shadow meant exposing the truth. Mike looked at the dog, who was already by the door, harness in his mouth, ready to work. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. A child's life mattered more than keeping secrets. Mike loaded Shadow into his truck and headed to the search area. Knowing everything was about to change, they arrived at the command post to stunned silence. Deputies and search personnel who'd attended Shadow's funeral stared in disbelief. Some made signs of the cross. Others reached for their phones before Mike's sharp command stopped them. The incident commander, a Forest Service veteran named Patricia Moss, approached slowly, her face pale. She'd been at the funeral, had personally placed a wreath on Shadow's grave. Mike kept his explanation simple. He didn't understand what had happened. Shadow had returned. Right now, all that mattered was finding Lucas Brennan. They could deal with questions later. Patricia nodded slowly, her professionalism overriding her shock. She briefed Mike on the search efforts so far. Lucas had been missing for almost 20 hours. His parents had last seen him playing near their tent. When they checked 10 minutes later, he was gone. The family had searched frantically before calling for help. Teams had been combing the forest in expanding circles, but the terrain was brutal, and the boy could be anywhere. Mike took Shadow to the family's campsite and let him smell Lucas's sleeping bag. Shadow's entire body went rigid with focus, his nose working the air and ground. Then he was moving, pulling hard on the lead, heading into the forest at an angle no search team had covered. Mike followed, trusting his partner completely. They pushed deep into the woods, Shadow tracking with absolute certainty. 2 miles in, the dog stopped at a ravine. Mike's heart sank. If Lucas had fallen down there, he might be seriously injured or worse. Shadow descended carefully, and Mike followed, using roots and rocks for handholds. At the bottom, Shadow picked up the trail again, moving urgently now. Mike could see small footprints in the mud, confirming they were on the right track. Another half-mile through increasingly difficult terrain, and Shadow stopped, barking sharply. Mike pushed through a thick stand of brush and found Lucas. The boy was alive, but unconscious, curled against a fallen log, his lips blue with hypothermia. Mike immediately called for medical evacuation and began warming the child with emergency blankets from his pack. Lucas stirred as Mike worked on him, his eyes opening slowly. He saw Shadow first and smiled weakly, reaching out to touch the dog's fur. Shadow lay down beside the boy, sharing his warmth, and Mike felt his throat tighten with emotion. This was why Shadow had come back. Not for Mike's benefit, but for moments like this. For children who needed saving. The helicopter arrived within 20 minutes, and Lucas was airlifted to the hospital. Mike and Shadow hiked back to the command post, where news of the successful rescue had already spread. They emerged from the forest to find 50 people waiting, deputies and search volunteers, and media who'd gotten wind of something extraordinary happening. Patricia Moss managed to keep most of them back, but there was no containing this story. Shadow, the K9 who died and been buried with full honors, had just saved a child's life. Mike stood in front of the cameras and gave the briefest statement possible. He didn't know how Shadow had returned. He was grateful beyond words. Right now, his focus was on Lucas's recovery. Everything else could wait. The story exploded across national news within hours. The dog who came back from the dead. Religious leaders called it a miracle. Scientists demanded to examine Shadow. Conspiracy theorists claimed government experiments. The sheriff's office phone lines were overwhelmed. Mike ignored all of it and drove straight to the hospital to check on Lucas. The boy was in stable condition, expected to make a full recovery. His parents were waiting in the hall, and when they saw Mike in Shadow, they broke down crying. Lucas's mother dropped to her knees beside Shadow, hugging the dog, thanking him over and over. Shadow accepted the attention with his usual patient dignity, his tail wagging slowly. Lucas's father shook Mike's hand and said their family owed Shadow everything. Mike told him Shadow was just doing his job. What he didn't say was that Shadow had apparently come back from death, specifically to keep doing that job. Over the next few days, Mike's cabin became a fortress under siege. Media trucks lined his driveway. Reporters shouted questions whenever he appeared. Religious pilgrims left offerings at Shadow's grave, which was now empty. Scientists from 3 universities requested access to Shadow for study. Tom Bradley worked overtime managing the chaos, establishing a perimeter around Mike's property and threatening arrest for trespassing. But even Tom was struggling with what had happened. One night, sitting in Mike's kitchen after clearing another batch of reporters, Tom asked the question directly. How had Shadow come back? Mike admitted he didn't know, and he'd stopped trying to figure it out. Shadow was here. He was healthy. He'd just saved a child's life. That was enough. Tom suggested maybe Shadow had never been meant to die yet. Maybe whatever force governed life and death had made a mistake and corrected it. Or maybe Shadow's purpose was so important that he'd been granted a second chance to fulfill it. Mike said those were just stories people told themselves to make sense of the inexplicable. The truth was simpler. Shadow was back, and Mike was going to make sure his partner's second life counted for something. Tom raised his beer bottle in a silent toast, and they drank to impossible miracles and second chances. 3 weeks after Lucas Brennan's rescue, the media frenzy had died down to a manageable roar. Mike had given one official interview to a respected journalist, explaining simply that Shadow had returned, and he wasn't going to question the gift. Scientists and religious leaders could debate the how and why. Mike's only concern was doing the work. The interview helped settle things down, though Shadow had become the most famous K9 in American history. People traveled from across the country hoping to catch a glimpse of him. The department's social media following had exploded, and Mike's quiet life had become very complicated. Sarah Chen finally visited to examine Shadow, bringing equipment from the veterinary clinic. She'd been at the funeral, had pronounced Shadow dead herself. Now she was clinically examining a dog who showed no sign of ever having been ill. His blood work was perfect. His organ function was optimal. His joints showed no inflammation. When Sarah finished her examination, she sat back and shook her head in wonder. Medically, Shadow was healthier than most 2-year-old dogs. Sarah asked Mike directly if he had any theory about what happened. Mike said he'd stopped theorizing. Sarah nodded slowly and made a confession. The night after Shadow's funeral, she dreamed about him. In the dream, Shadow had spoken to her, saying his work wasn't finished, that there were still people who needed him. Sarah had dismissed it as grief-induced fantasy, until Shadow had actually returned. Now she wondered if the dream had been something more. Mike didn't know what to say to that. But later, alone with Shadow, he asked the dog if his work really was unfinished. Shadow just looked at him with those knowing amber eyes and thumped his tail once. A week later, Mike made a decision. If Shadow was back to work, then they'd work. Mike returned to full active duty, with Shadow reinstated to the K9 program as operational lead. The department held a brief ceremony marking Shadow's return to service. The 2 new K9 teams Mike had trained reacted to Shadow with something approaching reverence. Their dogs would defer to Shadow instinctively. The first case after Shadow's official return was a missing teenager, a 16-year-old girl named Rebecca Stone, who'd vanished from a party. Her friends said she'd left with an older man in a dark pickup truck. 48 hours had passed, and the probability of finding her alive was dropping fast. Mike took Shadow to the party location. Shadow worked the scene methodically, sorting through dozens of scent trails until he locked onto one specific track. The dog pulled hard toward the road, indicating Rebecca had left in a vehicle. Mike expanded the search, driving roads near the party site, letting Shadow scent the air from the truck window. 2 miles from the party, Shadow barked sharply. Mike stopped, and Shadow led him into the woods. 50 yards in, they found Rebecca's phone. The location gave them a direction. Shadow seemed frustrated by the limitation of working from a vehicle. He wanted to track on foot, but the trail was beyond even his abilities now. Then Shadow did something Mike had never seen before. The dog leaped out and started running through the forest. Moving with absolute purpose, Mike grabbed his gear and followed, calling for backup. Shadow ran for almost 3 miles, never hesitating. He stopped at an abandoned farm property, moving directly to a barn. Inside, tied to a support beam, was Rebecca Stone. She was terrified but alive. Her captor had left her while getting supplies. Mike freed Rebecca quickly as backup arrived. They set up surveillance, and 3 hours later, a dark pickup pulled in. The driver was Dale Morrison, a registered sex offender. Morrison went into custody without incident. Later, Tom Bradley asked Mike how Shadow had known where to go. The barn was miles from the phone location, with no physical trail. Mike said he didn't know. Shadow had just known. Tom pointed out that was impossible. Mike agreed, then asked if it was more impossible than a dog returning from the dead. That settled it. Shadow's capabilities had expanded beyond normal K9 work into something else. Whatever had brought him back had enhanced his abilities in ways Mike was still discovering over the following months. Shadow proved this repeatedly. He'd track suspects through impossible conditions. He'd alert to dangers before they became apparent. He'd find evidence multiple search teams had missed. The department's solve rate climbed dramatically. Cold cases broke open. Mike and Shadow became legendary. 6 months after Shadow's return, Mike got a call about Ghost. The retired officer who'd taken him, Frank Paulson, said Ghost had gotten into trouble. The young dog had been fine for months, then suddenly became agitated, whining constantly, refusing to eat, trying to escape. Frank didn't know what was wrong. Mike agreed to visit. The drive took 2 hours, Shadow riding beside him. As they got closer, Shadow became alert. When they pulled into Frank's driveway, Ghost was waiting by the fence, barking frantically. The moment Ghost saw Shadow, he went silent. The 2 dogs stared at each other, and something passed between them. Ghost's agitation vanished instantly. Frank was clearly relieved. Mike spent an hour watching the dogs interact through the fence. Ghost pressed against it, as close to Shadow as possible. Shadow sat on the other side, radiating calm authority. Frank explained Ghost's behavior had started exactly 1 week ago. The young dog had woken with a howl, then been inconsolable since. Mike suspected he knew why. 1 week ago was the anniversary of Shadow's death. Somehow, Ghost had sensed something about his grandfather. Mike let Shadow through the gate. Ghost immediately pressed against him, seeking comfort. Shadow lay down, and Ghost curled beside him. Within minutes, Ghost was asleep. Mike and Frank talked on the porch. Frank was a former K9 handler who'd retired after taking a bullet. He understood working dogs and had been honored to take Ghost. But the last week had shaken him. Mike explained his theory about the anniversary. Frank nodded slowly. Mike suggested regular visits to maintain the connection. Frank agreed immediately. When it was time to leave, Ghost whined but didn't panic. Shadow made a low sound, and Ghost settled. On the drive home, Mike told Shadow they'd visit Ghost every week. Shadow's tail thumped approval. The regular visits to Frank's farm became a highlight of Mike's routine. Every Sunday, he and Shadow would make the 2-hour drive, spending afternoons working with Ghost. Frank proved excellent company, a man who understood the job without needing explanations. They'd sit on the porch after training, drinking coffee, watching the dogs play. Ghost was maturing rapidly, showing the same exceptional abilities that had made Shadow legendary. His nose was phenomenal. His drive to work was intense. Frank suggested that when Ghost was fully trained, maybe Mike would want to take him back. Mike considered it seriously. Having 2 canines of Shadow's lineage working together would be unprecedented. But ultimately, Mike decided Ghost was happy here, with space to run that Mike's cabin couldn't provide. They'd keep visiting, keep training, but Ghost's home was with Frank. 9 months after Shadow's return, the department got a case that would push both dogs to their limits. A serial arsonist had been targeting rural properties across 3 counties, burning down barns and outbuildings. No one had been hurt yet, but the fires were escalating. The arsonist was careful, leaving little evidence, always striking on moonless nights. 5 fires in 3 months, each more brazen than the last. Mike studied the pattern. All properties were isolated, owned by families who'd lived in the area for generations. There was rage in these fires, personal anger. Mike suspected someone local with a grudge. The break came when investigators found an accelerant pattern matching a specific industrial solvent. Mike tracked purchases, finding 3 individuals who'd bought large quantities recently. One name stood out: Richard Hollis, who'd lost his family farm to foreclosure 2 years earlier. Mike ran Hollis's background. Multiple complaints about threatening behavior, a history of blaming others, and recent social media posts ranting about old farming families destroying the county. Tom Bradley got them a warrant. Hollis wasn't home, but inside they found fire-starting materials, maps with properties marked, and a detailed plan for the next target. A barn owned by the Patterson family, scheduled to burn tonight. Mike checked his watch. They had maybe 3 hours. The Patterson property was 20 miles away, isolated. Perfect for arson. Mike coordinated with Tom to set up surveillance while appearing to leave it undefended. Mike and Shadow would wait inside the barn with 2 tactical deputies. They reached the Patterson place just before sunset and set up inside. The barn was full of hay and equipment, a tinderbox waiting for a match. Mike positioned his team carefully, with clear escape routes. Shadow lay beside Mike in the darkness, utterly still, every sense focused. Hours passed. Midnight came and went. Mike was starting to think Hollis had spotted their trap when Shadow's body went rigid. Someone was approaching. Mike signaled his team to hold and let Hollis get inside. They needed him with accelerant and ignition in hand. The barn door creaked open. A figure slipped inside, carrying a backpack and container. Hollis moved to the center and started splashing liquid across hay bales, working quickly. Mike waited until Hollis pulled out a lighter. Then he hit the spotlight and commanded Hollis to freeze. Hollis spun toward the light, face twisted with rage. Instead of surrendering, he flicked the lighter, flames springing to life. Mike couldn't let Hollis drop that lighter. The barn would become an inferno, trapping them inside. Mike gave Shadow the command. Take him. Shadow launched forward, covering 30 feet in seconds, hitting Hollis low and hard. The impact drove Hollis backward, the lighter flying from his hand, skittering away from the hay. Shadow's jaws clamped onto Hollis's arm and held with relentless pressure. Hollis screamed and tried to fight, but 80 pounds of trained K9 was immovable. Mike and his team rushed forward, securing Hollis quickly. One deputy grabbed the lighter, while another photographed evidence. The all-clear was called, and fire personnel began cleaning up the accelerant. Hollis was screaming, demanding a lawyer, claiming police brutality. Mike calmly read him his rights. The evidence was overwhelming. This was going straight to a plea deal and a long prison sentence as they loaded Hollis into a patrol car. Mrs. Patterson arrived with her husband. She looked at her barn, still standing, saved by minutes. She walked directly to Mike and Shadow, tears streaming, thanking them for saving her family's livelihood. The Pattersons had been farming this land for 4 generations. The barn held equipment they couldn't afford to replace. Losing it would have destroyed them. Mrs. Patterson knelt beside Shadow and placed both hands on his head, looking into those amber eyes. She told Shadow that God had sent him back because his work wasn't done, because there were still people who needed him. She said her grandmother had told stories about animals who served as guardians, spirits in fur who walked between worlds. Mrs. Patterson believed Shadow was one of those guardians, returned because his purpose was too important to end. Mike started to say Shadow was just a well-trained K9, but the words died. Because Mrs. Patterson wasn't wrong. Shadow had returned from death. Science couldn't explain it. Maybe the only explanation was the one that didn't make sense at all. The drive back to the cabin was quiet. Shadow slept in the passenger seat, exhausted but content. Mike glanced over and asked softly if that was true, if Shadow really was some kind of guardian spirit. The dog's ear twitched, but he didn't wake. Mike decided he'd take that as an answer. The Hollis arrest made regional news, another successful operation. But Mike noticed a change in how people reacted to Shadow. Before, they'd treated him like an exceptional working dog. Now, there was reverence, like they were in the presence of something sacred. People would reach out to touch Shadow as he passed, hoping his protection would transfer to them. Tom Bradley pulled Mike aside one evening and suggested they talk seriously about Shadow's status. The dog had become more than a K9, more than a department resource. He'd become a symbol, something people drew hope from. That brought responsibilities Mike needed to consider. Tom wasn't suggesting they retire Shadow. He was suggesting they be very careful about how they used him. Mike understood and agreed to be more selective about Shadow's deployments. The decision to deploy Shadow more selectively proved wise. Over the following months, Mike used Shadow only on the most difficult cases. A child abduction where time was critical. A murder investigation where the suspect's location was unknown. A search and rescue in terrain so difficult normal K9s couldn't navigate it. Each time, Shadow performed flawlessly. His legend grew with each success. The media started calling him the Miracle K9. Mike hated the sensationalism, but couldn't deny the results. Shadow had saved 14 lives in 6 months since his return. One autumn evening, Mike was sitting on his porch when a car pulled up. He recognized it immediately. Robert Mackenzie, the man whose family's murder had been solved years ago. Robert had stayed in touch, and Mike considered him a friend. Robert climbed out and walked to the porch, Shadow trotting over to greet him. Robert knelt and scratched behind Shadow's ears, his face showing emotions Mike couldn't read. Then Robert told Mike why he'd come. Robert's daughter, Emma, had been diagnosed with cancer. Stage 4, aggressive, maybe 6 months to live. Emma was 23, engaged, with her whole life ahead. Robert was watching his only child die, helpless to stop it. The pain was destroying him. He asked Mike if he believed Shadow really had come back through some kind of miracle. Mike admitted he didn't know what to believe anymore, but acknowledged something impossible had happened. Robert asked if Mike thought Shadow could help Emma. Not cure her, but maybe give her comfort, hope, some sense that miracles were possible, even in darkness. Mike said yes without hesitation, and offered to bring Shadow to visit Emma at the hospital. Robert's relief was palpable. 3 days later, Mike and Shadow walked into the oncology ward at Mercy Hospital. Emma Mackenzie was in a private room, thin and pale from chemotherapy, but her eyes lit up when she saw Shadow. Robert had told her about the legendary K9 who'd helped solve her uncle's murder. Shadow approached Emma's bed carefully, with a gentleness Mike had rarely seen. The dog seemed to understand she was fragile, moving slowly, letting Emma reach out first, Emma's hands buried in Shadow's fur, and she started crying. Not from sadness, but from something deeper. She told Mike she'd been so angry at God, at everything, for giving her cancer at 23. She'd felt abandoned, forgotten, like her life meant nothing. But seeing Shadow, knowing he'd come back from death, made her feel like maybe miracles were still possible. Like maybe her life still had meaning, even if it was going to be shorter than planned. Mike visited Emma 3 times a week for the next 2 months, always bringing Shadow. The dog would lie beside her bed for hours, patient and calm, letting her pet him and talk about everything she was feeling. The hospital staff noticed something remarkable. On days when Shadow visited, Emma's vital signs improved. Her pain levels decreased. Her mood lifted noticeably. The oncology nurses started requesting Shadow's visits for other patients. Mike found himself bringing Shadow to the cancer ward regularly. Shadow seemed to understand what these people needed. With Emma, he was gentle and comforting. With a scared child undergoing chemotherapy, he was playful and distracting. With an elderly man facing his final days, Shadow offered silent companionship. Mike watched his partner work with these patients and saw a side he'd never fully appreciated. Yes, Shadow was exceptional at tracking and tactical work. But he was also a healer, bringing comfort to people facing their darkest moments. Emma's cancer progressed despite treatment, but her spirits remained strong. She credited Shadow with giving her the strength to fight, to appreciate each day. Robert told Mike privately that Shadow had given his daughter something doctors couldn't provide, a sense of peace with whatever came next. 4 months after Shadow started visiting Emma, she passed away peacefully with her family around her. Robert called Mike immediately, asking if Shadow could come to the funeral. Mike agreed without hesitation. The funeral was held at a small church, packed with people mourning a life cut too short. Mike and Shadow sat in the back, not wanting to intrude. But Robert insisted they come forward, sit with the family, be recognized for the comfort they'd provided. During the service, the pastor spoke about miracles and faith, about how sometimes grace appears in unexpected forms. He pointed to Shadow and said this dog, who'd returned from death, had been an angel for Emma in her final months, a reminder that love and hope endure beyond physical limitations. Mike felt uncomfortable with the religious framing, but he couldn't deny the truth underneath it. Shadow had helped Emma die with dignity and peace. That mattered more than theological debates. After the service, people lined up to touch Shadow, seeking his healing presence. Mike almost stopped them, worried about overwhelming his partner. But Shadow stood calmly, accepting each person's touch, seeming to understand they needed this connection. On the drive home, Mike talked to Shadow about how their work had expanded beyond law enforcement into something else. Shadow listened with that knowing expression. That night, Mike couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about guardian spirits, about the pastor calling Shadow an angel, about all the lives his partner had touched. Mike had always been a skeptic, trusting only what he could prove. But Shadow's existence defied all those certainties. Mike walked out to the porch where Shadow was lying in moonlight. He sat beside his partner and asked the question building for months. Why had Shadow come back? Was there really some cosmic purpose? Shadow looked at him with those amber eyes and made a soft sound, something between a whine and a sigh. Then the dog stood and walked to the porch edge, staring at the dark forest. Mike followed Shadow's gaze and saw lights in the distance, headlights moving along the mountain road. Then he heard it, carried on the night wind. Sirens. Multiple units, heading fast. Mike's radio crackled. Major incident. All units respond. A tour bus had gone off the mountain road, rolled down an embankment. Unknown casualties. Mike was moving before the dispatcher finished. Shadow was already at the truck door. They raced toward the accident scene, arriving to find chaos. The bus had tumbled 200 feet down a steep slope, coming to rest on its side in a creek bed. First responders were trying to reach it, but the terrain was treacherous, the wreckage unstable. The bus driver was dead, but passengers were trapped inside, screaming for help. Mike assessed the situation quickly. They needed to get people out before the bus shifted and slid further into deeper water. But the approach was too dangerous for rescuers carrying equipment. They needed someone to go in first, assess conditions, determine the safest extraction route. Mike looked at Shadow and knew what had to be done. He fitted Shadow with a harness, equipped with camera and microphone, technology acquired specifically for dangerous reconnaissance. Shadow would descend the slope, enter the bus through a broken window, and send back video showing what they were dealing with. It was risky, asking a dog to enter an unstable wreck. Mike gave the command, and Shadow descended with careful precision. The camera feed showed Shadow reaching the bus and squeezing through a shattered window. Inside was carnage. Passengers thrown around by the crash, some injured badly, some in shock, all terrified. Shadow moved through the bus carefully, his camera giving rescuers critical information about structural stability, passenger locations, and best entry points. Based on Shadow's reconnaissance, the rescue team developed a plan. They'd stabilize the bus with cables, then extract passengers through the rear emergency exit which Shadow had identified as structurally sound. The operation took 3 hours, but all 17 surviving passengers were pulled from the wreck before it shifted and slid into deeper water. Shadow had given them the intelligence they needed to save lives. Later, as dawn broke and the scene was cleared, Mike sat on his truck bumper with Shadow beside him. Tom Bradley joined them, bringing coffee and exhausted silence. After a while, Tom said what Mike was thinking. Shadow kept ending up exactly where he needed to be, exactly when people needed him most: the mountain rescue, the barn arson, Emma's bedside, tonight's bus accident. It was like Shadow could sense when and where he was needed. Tom didn't believe in fate or destiny, but he was running out of rational explanations for Shadow's consistent presence at critical moments. Mike said maybe they were overthinking it. Maybe Shadow was just a really good K9 who got lucky a lot. Tom laughed and said nobody got this lucky this consistently. They finished their coffee in silence, watching sunrise paint the mountains gold and red. Shadow was sleeping between them, looking like an ordinary old dog resting after a hard shift. But Mike knew better. Shadow wasn't ordinary, and his work was far from finished. Whatever had brought him back for a reason. The bus rescue made national news, with Shadow once again the hero. Video from his camera harness showed the harrowing interior and his incredible courage navigating unstable wreckage. The story went viral, shared millions of times. Shadow became not just a regional legend, but a national one. Mike's phone rang constantly with interview requests, book deals, movie offers. He declined them all. Shadow wasn't a commodity to be exploited. He was a working K9 doing his job. The attention did bring some benefits, though. Donations flooded into the department's K9 program. Other agencies reached out asking for training help. Mike found himself consulting with departments across the state, sharing techniques, helping them build their own programs. Shadow's legacy was expanding beyond just his own work into influencing how K9 units operated everywhere. One morning, Mike got an unexpected call from the FBI. Agent Cortez, who'd worked the Reeves brothers case years ago, had been promoted to a senior position. She was forming a specialized task force to handle major crimes in rural areas and wanted Mike to lead it. He'd keep his position as sheriff, but coordinate multi-jurisdictional operations across a 3-county area. It was recognition of everything Mike had built. A year ago, Mike would have said yes immediately. Now, sitting on his porch with Shadow sleeping in a patch of sunlight, Mike wasn't sure he'd achieved what he set out to do. The department was strong. The community was safe. Justice was being served. Did he need to do more? Tom didn't push for an answer when Mike told him about the offer. They just sat together as darkness fell and stars came out. It was Shadow who made the decision. The dog came over and sat between them, looking up with intelligent eyes. He was Shadow's grandson Ghost's grandfather, carrying that genetic legacy forward. Mike realized he wanted to see what else they could accomplish together, wanted to continue the work while honoring what Shadow represented. Mike told Tom he'd accept the task force position, with conditions. He'd maintain his current responsibilities and need time to properly balance everything. Tom smiled and said those conditions had already been negotiated. The state wasn't asking Mike to change what he was doing. They were asking him to teach others how to do it too. That night, Mike sat alone on his porch with Shadow at his feet. He looked up at the stars and thought about everything they'd accomplished together. He thought about the Mackenzie family getting justice, Emma Foster safe at home, plane crash survivors celebrating another year. He thought about all the cases still unsolved, all the people still waiting for someone to care enough to help. The work was never finished. There would always be another case, another victim, another chance to make a difference. That was the burden and blessing of law enforcement. You couldn't save everyone, but you never stopped trying. Mike looked down at Shadow, who was watching him with attentive eyes, and felt responsibility settle onto his shoulders once again. This dog was counting on him. The community was counting on him. And somewhere, Mike liked to think, all those they'd saved were grateful they'd been given a second chance. Just like Shadow had been given a second chance. Mike stood up, Shadow immediately rising beside him. They went inside together, and Mike pulled out his training journals. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities to make a difference. Shadow's resurrection had taught Mike something important. Sometimes impossible things happen. Sometimes miracles are real. And sometimes a good cop and his partner get a second chance to finish their work. The task force position brought new challenges and opportunities. Mike found himself coordinating operations across 3 counties, bringing together departments that had traditionally worked in isolation. His reputation and Shadow's legend made cooperation easier than it might have been. When Sheriff Mike Cross and the Miracle K9 asked for help, agencies responded. Tom Bradley handled most day-to-day sheriff duties, freeing Mike to focus on the bigger picture. The arrangement worked well, with both men playing to their strengths. The department continued to thrive under their joint leadership. Shadow's role evolved into something unique. He was still operational, still saved lives regularly, but he'd also become a symbol and teaching tool. Mike brought Shadow to training sessions across the region, demonstrating techniques, inspiring handlers and their canines. Young dogs seemed to recognize something special in Shadow, deferring to him instinctively. Their handlers learned not just from watching Shadow work, but from understanding the bond between dog and handler that made everything else possible. The visits to Frank's farm and Ghost continued every Sunday. The young German Shepherd was now 2 years old and fully mature, showing remarkable abilities that confirmed the bloodline's quality. Ghost had Shadow's nose, his drive, and increasingly his judgment. Frank had done excellent work training him, and Mike was proud of what Ghost had become. The three of them would run training exercises together on Frank's property. It was during one of these sessions that Mike noticed something extraordinary. Shadow was teaching Ghost, deliberately showing the younger dog techniques Mike had never formally trained. How to work a scent cone in difficult wind. How to read human body language for threat assessment. How to conserve energy during long tracks. Ghost absorbed these lessons with focused intensity, and Mike realized he was witnessing something special. Shadow was passing on knowledge that went beyond formal training into instinct and experience. Frank saw it too, and asked Mike if Shadow knew his time was limited. If the older dog was deliberately preparing Ghost to carry on, Mike didn't answer directly, but the thought haunted him. Shadow seemed as vital as ever, showing no signs of declining health. But there was something in the way he worked with Ghost, a purposefulness that suggested Shadow understood his resurrection hadn't made him immortal. He was here for a reason, and part of that reason was ensuring the next generation was ready. Winter came hard that year, with record snowfall blanketing the mountains. The department stayed busy with weather-related emergencies. Shadow worked constantly, his ability to navigate difficult terrain making him invaluable. In one particularly brutal week, he helped rescue 4 different groups of stranded hikers, located 2 people trapped in vehicles by avalanches, and tracked down a teenager who'd wandered from a ski resort. Mike worried about pushing Shadow too hard, but the dog seemed energized by the work rather than depleted. One night, after a particularly grueling rescue, Mike asked Sarah Chen to examine Shadow again. Sarah's findings were remarkable. Shadow's physical condition remained exceptional, showing no signs of aging despite intense activity. His joints were healthy, his cardiovascular system strong. By every measurable standard, Shadow was thriving. Sarah said it was medically impossible, but then again, so was returning from death. Maybe normal rules just didn't apply to Shadow anymore. Mike found comfort in that assessment, though it raised as many questions as it answered. Spring brought a case that would test Mike and Shadow in unexpected ways. A series of home invasions had been targeting elderly residents in rural areas. The perpetrators were professional, disabling security systems, moving quickly, stealing cash and valuables. They'd hit 15 homes over 3 months, and the pattern suggested inside information. Mike suspected someone in home health care or social services was providing information to the criminals. The investigation was complex, requiring coordination between multiple agencies. Mike formed a task force, bringing together detectives from 3 counties. They analyzed the pattern, looking for connections. The breakthrough came when they identified a common link. All victims had recently received services from the same medical equipment company. Mike got a warrant and searched company records, finding that employee Marcus Webb had accessed files for all 15 victims just days before break-ins. Webb was brought in for questioning but denied everything. Without physical evidence linking him to the crimes, they couldn't hold him. Mike needed proof, needed to catch Webb or his accomplices in the act. They set up surveillance on Webb and identified 2 associates, brothers named Kyle and Trevor Mason with criminal records for burglary. Mike suspected they were doing the break-ins while Webb provided intelligence. But proving it required catching them in the act. Mike coordinated with the task force to identify likely next targets based on Webb's file access patterns. They narrowed it to 3 homes and set up surveillance on all 3. 2 weeks passed with no activity. Mike was starting to think the crew had gone to ground when Shadow alerted during a routine patrol near one of the monitored homes. Mike had been driving past the area when Shadow went rigid, staring toward the house with intense focus. Mike pulled over and grabbed his binoculars. At first, he saw nothing unusual. Then movement caught his eye. Someone was approaching the house from the rear, Mike called for backup and moved into position with Shadow. The suspects, Kyle and Trevor Mason, were disabling the back door lock when Mike and Shadow emerged from cover. The brothers ran, splitting up. Mike pursued Trevor while Shadow went after Kyle. Mike tackled Trevor in the backyard and had him in handcuffs within seconds. Meanwhile, Shadow had run Kyle down and held him at bay until deputies arrived. Both brothers were arrested, and a search of their vehicle revealed tools, stolen items from previous break-ins, and most importantly, a phone with text messages from Marcus Webb describing tonight's target. Webb was arrested within the hour. The entire crew went down, and 15 families who'd been living in fear finally had justice. The case made regional news, another successful operation. But for Mike, the most significant aspect was how it had unfolded. Shadow had alerted to the crime when Mike was just driving past on routine patrol. There was no reason to be in that area at that time. Except Mike was starting to believe there was no such thing as chance where Shadow was concerned. Summer arrived, and with it came reflection. 2 years had passed since Shadow's resurrection. In that time, the legendary K9 had saved 43 lives, solved dozens of major cases, and inspired law enforcement agencies across the country. The department Mike led had become a model for rural policing. Mike's personal life had found balance too. He'd made peace with the impossible nature of Shadow's return, accepting the gift without needing to understand it. The nightmares that had plagued him for years had faded. Shadow had given him more than just a second chance at partnership. The dog had given him a second chance at life. One July evening, Mike was sitting on his porch when he heard a vehicle coming up his driveway. He recognized the sound before he saw it. Frank Paulson's truck. But Frank wasn't scheduled to visit, and it was the middle of the week. Mike felt his stomach tighten. Frank climbed out of the truck, and Ghost jumped down after him. The young German shepherd looked healthy and strong, but there was something different about him. A maturity in his bearing that hadn't been there before. Frank walked to the porch slowly, his expression serious. Shadow got up from his usual spot and went to greet Ghost. The two dogs touched noses, then sat side by side, both facing Mike and Frank. Frank told Mike he'd made a decision. Ghost was ready for active duty, ready to become a working K9. Frank had trained him well, but Ghost needed real work now, needed purpose and challenge. Frank believed Ghost should be with Mike, should work alongside Shadow, learn from his grandfather while the old dog was still here. Mike started to object, to say Ghost was happy on the farm, but Frank cut him off. Ghost wasn't happy anymore. The young dog knew he was meant for more than farm life. He needed to work, needed to serve, needed to fulfill the potential in his blood. Mike looked at Ghost, really looked at him, and saw Frank was right. The young dog was ready. More than ready. And having Ghost would help when Shadow finally had to step back. Mike agreed to take Ghost on a trial basis. Frank smiled with relief and emotion. He'd grown to love Ghost, but he understood working dogs needed to work. That night, Mike had 2 German shepherds in his cabin for the first time. Shadow and Ghost settled quickly into a routine, with Ghost deferring to Shadow on everything. Mike watched them together and saw the bond, the communication that passed between grandfather and grandson. Over the following weeks, Mike integrated Ghost into department operations. The young dog was phenomenal, his training solid, his instincts sharp. He worked well with other K9 teams. But the real magic happened when Ghost worked with Shadow. Together, they were unstoppable. Shadow's experience combined with Ghost's youth and energy created a partnership that exceeded what either could do alone. On tracks, Shadow would lead with Ghost providing stamina for long pursuits. In tactical situations, Shadow's judgment guided Ghost's enthusiasm into precise action. Mike found himself working both dogs simultaneously, a complex choreography that required absolute trust. It was exhausting and exhilarating. One case demonstrated their combined power perfectly. A child predator had been abducting children from rural areas, holding them for ransom, then releasing them after payment. 3 children had been taken over 6 months. All returned physically unharmed, but psychologically traumatized. The FBI was involved, but the kidnapper was careful, leaving no forensic evidence. When a 4th child disappeared, a 10-year-old boy named Aaron Mitchell, Mike deployed both Shadow and Ghost. They worked the abduction site together, each dog following different aspects of the scent picture. Shadow tracked the kidnapper's approach route while Ghost followed Aaron's scent. The trails converged 2 miles away at a service road where a vehicle had been parked. From there, the trail went cold for normal tracking. But Shadow and Ghost weren't normal. The 2 dogs worked together, casting in expanding circles. Ghost picked up something and started pulling toward a nearby stream. Shadow followed, confirming the trail. They tracked along the stream for nearly 5 miles, difficult terrain that would have defeated most canines. At an old hunting cabin, both dogs alerted. Inside, they found Aaron Mitchell, frightened but alive, guarded by the armed and desperate kidnapper. The tactical entry was perfect, with Mike coordinating breach while both dogs provided intimidation and control. The kidnapper, Stephen Walsh, with a history of child abuse, surrendered when faced with 2 highly trained German shepherds. Aaron was reunited with his family, and Walsh went into custody. The FBI profiler working the case told Mike she'd never seen K9 work at that level. The way Shadow and Ghost had worked together, communicating and coordinating, was something she'd read about in theory but never witnessed. Mike just smiled and said good training and better bloodlines. But he knew it was more than that. Shadow was teaching Ghost not just how to work but how to think, how to make decisions, how to be more than just a tracking machine. Over the following months, Mike, Shadow, and Ghost became an inseparable team. The department bought a larger truck to accommodate both dogs. Mike's training schedule expanded to keep both dogs sharp, and the results spoke for themselves. Case after case closed. Lives saved. Families reunited. Justice served. Mike noticed something else too. Shadow seemed more relaxed, less driven. Like having Ghost there had lifted some burden from him. The old dog still worked brilliantly when needed, but he was content to let Ghost take the lead more often. Mike wondered if this was what Shadow had been waiting for, preparing Ghost to eventually take over. One autumn evening, Mike was running both dogs through training exercises when Shadow stopped suddenly. The old dog stood perfectly still, staring toward the mountains, ears forward, every sense focused on something Mike couldn't perceive. Ghost stopped too, mimicking Shadow's posture, learning by observation. Mike followed their gaze, but saw nothing unusual. Just mountains and forest, and the last light of sunset painting everything gold. Shadow made a soft sound, something Mike had never heard before. Almost like satisfaction. Like completion. Then Shadow relaxed, shook himself, and trotted over to Mike for affection. The moment passed, but Mike remembered it. That night, Mike sat on his porch with both dogs lying at his feet. Shadow on his right, Ghost on his left. 3 years had passed since that impossible night when Shadow had clawed his way out of the grave. 3 years of miracles and mysteries, and moments that defied explanation. Mike still didn't understand why Shadow had come back. Maybe he never would. But sitting there with both dogs, feeling their warmth and trust, Mike realized understanding wasn't necessary. Shadow had returned because some work couldn't be left unfinished. Some bonds were too strong for death to break. Some purposes were too important to abandon. And now, with Ghost ready to carry forward the legacy, Shadow's resurrection made sense in a way logic couldn't explain. The work would continue. The bloodline would endure. And Mike Cross would keep doing what he'd always done. Standing between the innocent and those who would harm them. With his partners beside him. one who defied death itself, and one who carried that defiance in his blood. Mike looked up at the stars and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new cases, new opportunities. But tonight, he was just a man with two exceptional dogs, grateful for impossible gifts and second chances. 5 years after Shadow's resurrection, the legend had become part of local folklore. Children grew up hearing stories about the K9 who came back from death to keep protecting people. The department Mike led was now considered one of the finest in the state. Ghost had fully matured into an exceptional K9, working alongside Shadow in perfect harmony. Mike had aged too, now 53, with more gray in his hair, but he was healthier and happier than he'd been in decades. Shadow still worked, though more selectively now. Mike had learned to read the subtle signs when his partner was tired. Ghost handled most routine operations, while Shadow focused on complex cases requiring his unique abilities. The arrangement worked perfectly. One spring morning, Mike got a call that would bring everything full circle. Robert Mackenzie's voice was excited as he explained that his foundation, established in Emma's memory, was hosting a ceremony honoring first responders. Shadow was being recognized with a special Lifetime Achievement Award. The ceremony would be at the state capitol. With the governor presenting awards, Robert wanted Mike and Shadow to attend. Mike's first instinct was to decline. He didn't do ceremonies or awards. But Robert pressed, explaining that Shadow's story had inspired the foundation's work with cancer patients. Therapy dog programs across the state had been established because of Shadow's visits to Emma. The award wasn't just recognition. It was gratitude from hundreds of families who'd found comfort because of Shadow's example. Mike agreed to attend. The ceremony was scheduled for 3 weeks away. He spent those weeks making sure both Shadow and Ghost were in peak condition. The day of the ceremony arrived clear and warm. Mike dressed in his formal sheriff's uniform, medals earned over a career of service. Shadow wore his official K9 vest, badges marking him as a working law enforcement dog. Ghost came too, representing the next generation. The Capitol building was impressive, all marble and history. The ceremony was held in the main hall, packed with first responders, their families, and dignitaries. Mike felt out of place, but Shadow's presence beside him provided comfort. When Shadow's name was called, the entire room stood and applauded. Mike walked to the stage with Shadow at his side, Ghost following a respectful distance behind. The governor greeted them warmly. She gave a speech about Shadow's incredible career, the lives saved, the cases solved, and most remarkably, the impossible return from death that had become a symbol of hope. The governor presented Mike with a plaque and Shadow with a special collar, custom-made leather with silver inlays marking his achievements. Shadow sat patiently through the ceremony, accepting attention with his usual dignity. Then Robert Mackenzie took the stage to present a second award. The Emma Mackenzie Memorial Award for Compassionate Service, given to recognize those who bring comfort and healing to people facing their darkest moments. Shadow was the first recipient. Robert's voice broke as he talked about his daughter's final months, how Shadow's visits had given Emma strength and peace. He talked about hundreds of letters from families touched by therapy dogs, all citing Shadow's story as inspiration. Shadow, who'd come back from death, had shown people that impossible things could happen. That hope endured. As Robert finished speaking, he did something unexpected. He called Ghost to the stage. The young German shepherd walked up confidently, sitting beside Shadow. Robert explained that Ghost represented the future, carrying forward Shadow's legacy. The foundation was establishing a scholarship program to train therapy dogs for hospital work, and Ghost would be the program's first graduate and teaching dog. Mike looked down at both dogs, grandfather and grandson, side by side before hundreds of people, and felt overwhelming pride. This was what Shadow's resurrection had been about. Not just saving lives in the moment, but inspiring others to do the same. After the ceremony, Mike was surrounded by well-wishers, handlers wanting to shake his hand, families wanting to meet Shadow. Mike tried to be gracious, but the crowd was overwhelming. Shadow and Ghost both sensed his discomfort and pressed close, providing support. Finally, Mike excused himself and took both dogs outside to a quiet garden. They sat on a bench, Mike in the middle, Shadow on one side, Ghost on the other. For a few minutes, nobody spoke or moved. Just three partners sharing a moment of peace. Tom Bradley found them there an hour later. He'd attended the ceremony, but had given Mike space during the chaos. Now he sat down and told Mike the department had received authorization to expand the K-9 program again. They'd be adding 2 more teams, bringing the total to 8. Tom asked Mike if he wanted to lead the expansion personally or delegate it. Mike thought about it carefully. He was 53, had been in law enforcement for over 30 years, had rebuilt a department from the ground up. He'd accomplished more than most sheriffs managed in entire careers. He could delegate, could step back and enjoy the success. But looking at Shadow and Ghost, Mike knew he wasn't done yet. The work that had brought Shadow back from death wasn't finished. There were still cases to solve, still lives to save, still people who needed protecting. Mike told Tom he'd lead the expansion personally, train the new teams himself, ensure they understood that being a K-9 handler wasn't just a job. It was a partnership, a bond, a commitment that transcended normal duty. Tom smiled and said he'd expected that answer. They talked logistics for a while, planning the expansion. Shadow and Ghost lay at their feet, relaxed and content. As evening approached and they prepared to leave, Mike took one last look at the Capitol building. Inside, people were celebrating first responders. Out here, in the quiet garden, Mike and his partners were just 3 individuals who'd been given a gift. Shadow had been given a second life. Mike had been given a second chance at purpose. Ghost had been given a legacy to carry forward. None of them fully understood why these gifts had been granted, but they'd all committed to making them count. The drive home took 3 hours. They stopped at Frank's farm on the way, spending an hour visiting. Frank had retired completely now, but he still loved seeing Ghost. He told Mike he'd done good work preparing Ghost, and Mike returned the compliment. As they left the farm and headed toward home, Mike felt content. Not satisfied, because the work was never done, but content with the journey they were on. Shadow had come back from death for a reason, and together they were fulfilling that purpose one case at a time. When they reached the cabin, Mike let both dogs out and they ran into the forest, playing together. Shadow was slower than Ghost but still vital, still engaged with life and work. Mike watched them and made a silent promise. He'd honor the gift by working until the job was done, by protecting those who couldn't protect themselves, by never giving up on justice, by training the next generation to carry forward the mission. Shadow and Ghost emerged from the forest and trotted over to Mike. Both dogs were dirty and happy, tongues lolling, eyes bright. Mike scratched behind their ears and told them they were good boys. The best boys. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, Mike Cross was just a sheriff with 2 exceptional German shepherds, grateful for impossible miracles and the chance to make a difference. Shadow had clawed his way out of the grave because his work wasn't finished. 5 years later, that work continued. And it would keep continuing as long as Shadow had breath, as long as Ghost carried the bloodline forward, as long as Mike had strength to lead them. Some bonds were too strong for death to break. Some purposes too important to abandon. Together, they'd proven that truth. And together, they'd keep proving it for as long as the work needed doing. Mike looked at his 2 partners, standing side by side in the fading light, and knew with absolute certainty that whatever came next, they'd face it together. just like they always had, just like they always would. The retired officer and his legendary K9 who defied death itself, and the young dog who carried that legend forward into the future. Their tales were far from over.